I was trying to solve for the tension that comes with students' anticipation of, am I going to get, a 25 out of 25 this week? I actually did not want them to think like that throughout the quarter. I wanted them to see it as a container for experimentation. I felt ungrading could do that.
Ungrading allows me to reserve the right to ask students to resubmit without penalty. I tell them from the beginning of the class that if you get an incomplete on an assignment, that's actually not a bad thing. It's actually, it's expected. It's actually something I want to reward. I want to see your voice. I want to see something that wouldn't be seen as perfect or correct.
Feedback is the most time intensive and perhaps the most important. A lot of learning happens for students in feedback. And what I love about ungrading is that it makes the best use of that feedback time. I am giving students feedback that I hope will directly impact them as writers who are learning to write, not just in my class, but over their entire lifetime.
Welcome to the Teaching and Learning Center's Spotlight on Teaching, where we share stories from our teaching community at UC Santa Cruz. In this edition, we connect with 3 UCSC educators about their experiences and observations of using ungrading in their courses.
I'm Dr. Heather Shear. I'm a faculty member in the writing program, and I've been on campus now for about 13 years. Currently, I use a combination of labor-based contract grading and specs grading. That's sort of a hybrid form of ungrading, I guess, in the composition courses that I teach for the writing program. And I've been doing this, I guess, for about 5 years, really since the start of the pandemic.
My name is Sylvain Vaccarino. I use he, him pronouns. I'm actually a PhD candidate in social psychology with a designated emphasis in critical race and ethnic studies. I was also an undergraduate here, and I got to experience ungrading as an undergraduate student. I was also a TA in an ungrading class. And I've also been an instructor of record for ungrading courses in the writing program, also in developmental psychology courses and in upper division social psychology courses. I've had experience, shifting between narrative evaluation, contract grading, even self-assessment, and even sometimes doing a little bit of combination of all 3 of those, kind of having my own flavor of ungrading.
My name is Dorothy Santos, and I am an assistant teaching professor in the art department. That's my home department. And I'm core faculty in creative technologies, which is an online degree. It's focused on art, design, very justice centric. So, very much an interdisciplinary degree. I got my PhD at UC Santa Cruz in film and digital media and a designated emphasis in computational media in terms of the forms of ungrading that I use. So it's definitely, self-evaluation, students engaging in midterm reflections, deciding on the type of grade that they feel where they're at. Definitely, very straightforward binary. Unfortunately, I don't like binaries, but the incomplete complete, instead of having a points-based system, that's another way that I ungrade. And also, I guess what's more commonly known as contract grading, which is here's the thing that you do, here are the things you do to get an A, here's what you do to get a B.
How did you first get into ungrading? Was there a problem you were trying to solve or a value that you hold about teaching and learning that you were trying to enact?
As a student, I had experienced ungrading in a cultural development psychology course, and it was very writing heavy. I was a transfer student, so that was the first time that I got um, to really think about my learning, to learn about how I learn and also to enjoy and value iteration. Really like enjoying messing up and taking some risks. And so that was, I mean, that was really incredible for my writing and also helped me even think about being a researcher, just my own academic self-concept. And then as an instructor, the thing that I was really focusing on, very values focused. So for me, it's really important that we're challenging the racial, gendered, class, and ableist assumptions in the class that often inform what it means to be a good student or how to learn. And because my classes are often social justice based, ungrading is a way to start the class off talking about social justice and talking about some of those norms in the classroom, on campus, in our conceptions about what it means to be a public intellectual or to be a scholar. And so I'm always trying to think about ways to um, challenge those in the class, talk about those in the class, and invite students into other ways of learning, or even just bringing in their ways of knowing and writing or learning from their community, and show how that's actually relevant to their learning and their growth in higher education. One of the things that brought me to ungrading is also thinking about what is it that students actually experience when it comes to grades. I think that there's a difference in what grades do for students compared to what instructors think grades are doing. We know that students have often report grades as a main source of anxiety and stress for them. And a lot of that because there's material consequences to their grades. I mean, in some places, receiving low grades threatens their student status. It threatens their access to financial aid, to housing, and increases maybe student debt. So then grades are potentially less about encouragement and more and less about motivating students, and potentially more about correcting their habits to perform better, so that way they can maintain housing or maintain a daycare or things like that. And so that was one of the things that made me want to shift away, just de-emphasize grades a little bit, and to recenter back to what is actually the learning goal here, what is motivating their engagement in this class and in this content, um, and potentially just putting a pause on some of those stressors, and just suggesting, like, maybe just for this class you're safe and now let's learn.
I was introduced to what we would now call ungrading in the 90s when I was a graduate student, a master's student. And I read a book by a composition scholar named Ira Shore, who talked about a form of contract grading that he uses when he teaches. He essentially advocates for a form of contract grading and syllabus building that allows students to co-construct with the instructor sort of what would count for an A, what counts for a B, and so on, and what some of the syllabus policies would be. And he does this in part to help, we might say now, to reveal the hidden curriculum of the course. Especially important, he notes, for working class students who are coming to the university without the same level of cultural preparation that other people might have. And at the time, I'm from the working class, and I was teaching a largely working class population. This really seemed so fascinating to me, and I was very engaged with it, and it worked really, really well there. But then, years pass, and I end up here at UCSC, and the pandemic hits. And this offered a great opportunity to experiment because there was so much experimentation happening. Everybody was moving from in-person courses to online courses. Some of the challenges seem to be able to be resolved by simplifying grading, which is kind of sort of what ungrading does, at least some forms of ungrading. Essentially, you hit a certain mark and that's a pass. It's kind of like a form of pass, no pass grading in a way. And for a class like writing, where what we want is for students to focus on improving their writing over time, we want them to focus less on, is it an A, a B, or C, and focus more on, am I doing the kind of work I need to do to become a better writer?
My first instantiation and understanding of what ungrading actually meant was one of my really good friends when I was in grad school. I was working on my master's, and one of my really good friends, Emily Holmes, really brilliant writer. I learned about Emily's experiences at Evergreen, where it's all qualitative. And she goes, "Oh, we didn't get grades at Evergreen." She didn't call it ungrading, but when I got to UC Santa Cruz, as a faculty member, that's when I kind of went back in my mind and I was like, what would my experience have been like um, if I had that opportunity to be ungraded as an undergrad? I probably would have performed better, but and I wasn't the best student. And so I wondered, what would it look like if I did a mix, if I did all ungrading? I was trying to solve for the tension that comes with students' anticipation of, am I going to get, a 25 out of 25 this week? I didn't want, I actually did not want them to think like that throughout the quarter. I wanted them to see it as a container for experimentation. And I felt ungrading could do that. And I always try to remind my students at the end of the day, you're not doing this work for me. You're doing it for yourself. I'm giving you the tools. I'm here to support you. The lectures and the presentations or the guest speakers that come through, it's like it's your responsibility to evaluate what is most fruitful and what is most helpful for your scholarship, for your art making, etc.
What are you excited about in your current ungrading practices or experiments?
It's an asynchronous online section of writing too that I've been teaching. And I've really been putting in a lot of time and effort into refining it. So in this course, there are different types of assignments. And some assignments are more what we will call process assignments in writing. These are things that you're asking students to do, like brainstorming, or sometimes they even ask students to do things like take a walk and talk about their project with a friend, or sit and talk with their friend. These kinds of things that writers naturally do, but that novice writers might not think of doing, and they get credit for doing this. In the past, I had a whole level of specs where they had to meet certain things with this, and I was spending a lot of time providing feedback on these assignments, which didn't make sense. And so I'm transitioning more to a simplified, like thumbs up, thumbs down, you either did it or you didn't kind of thing. It's like more of a labory based contract grading versus other assignments in the class that are more formal, like the proposal, major projects, where it's becoming less like a labor based thing and more like a specs thing. And so to earn a thumbs up on the assignment overall, they really have to meet all of these different specifications. The reason that I've done this, one, it's a labor issue. Providing feedback on the process things was a waste of my time and a waste of their time. The feedback wasn't really that helpful for them. But also, artificial intelligence, generative AI, it's now like a third person in the room, right? So I'm now really focusing on just saying, did you do it? They tell me they did it, and I say, okay, and we're moving on. The students who do it get the benefit of doing it. The students who don't do it don't get the benefit of doing it, and we just go on with our lives. But with the more formal assignments, I mean, one of the agreements that we make by offering a required composition course is that we need to be able to certify that students can do certain things in the course. And unfortunately, with ChatGPT, which is really good at hitting generic targets, we need to be much more specific and create writing assignments that, to put it plainly, are harder for something like ChatGPT, which really stinks at things like analysis, for example, are harder for that kind of technology to help students complete in a way that unethically undermines their education. And so this has pushed me more towards specs grading. I think it's fun, though. I'm not being a doomsday person here, because it's making me think more carefully about my assignments. I'm innovating and creating new assignments. I think it's ultimately going to help students to understand the nature of assignments a little bit more. It's just, we have to now think about things that we didn't have to think about before.
I had tried this one assignment. I almost never do exams. I almost always do projects or papers. So I tried an exam one time, and I tried like an exam wrapper where the students take the test, and then the idea is that afterwards they get their results. And then they get to write a reflection or reflect on their study habits and things like that. And so what I adapted with that exam wrapper was I wanted students to identify something that they had missed in that exam, and then actually develop a tutorial or like a mini lesson on how they would teach a peer, because I kind of affirmed like it's likely that you're not the only person that got that wrong. How, if you had to have a study group, what would you do? And I was just trying to test it out, and it was like a question on the exam wrapper, and it ended up being very interesting, and students really engaged with it. And some students told me later that they really liked that part, and it helped them actually learn the thing that they had missed. Then I'm decentering myself as the main instructor, and everybody gets to kind of support each other on what they're having to relearn or having to go back um, and navigate what their mistakes or failures were. So I'm really excited about that. And I think the ungrading allowed me to kind of arrive at something so creative, because it frees me up from thinking about like how do I ensure that they are meeting the requirements, because I'm already thinking about their learning and less about how do I fit this into like the point scheme or percentage scheme.
Right now, many educators are asking important questions about the role of AI in teaching and learning, especially with regard to academic integrity. When you use ungrading, what do you notice with regard to academic integrity, if anything? Has AI reshaped anything in your ungrading practices?
I'm a part of many kind of working groups, writing groups, creative kind of practice groups. And in one of the groups that I'm in, Naima Lowe, who's an artist and a scholar, I remember them saying something around, well, if my students are using I feel like I need to be even more creative with the prompt of the assignment. So it's like I can't put it all on the student. And there's something to that. And I really appreciate Naima actually stating that it also, as educators, takes creativity on our part to ensure that students have some, have more than an iota of academic integrity. But I personally really love Naima's call to action as educators, like, well, how do we become creative? And oftentimes, what I will do is my prompting has become a little bit more very self-specific, where it's like, only you could answer this. Like, not even Chat GPT, Claude, Poe, Google Gemini, whatever you want to use, like I'm asking something very specific of you that it would seem almost nonsensical if you asked an AI this or a chatbot this thing that I'm asking you. And I think how it's changed is again being much more mindful and overt with students and saying, like, this is also your education. Our world is changing so fast, and um, there's so much as educators that we have to keep up with. That, my hope and invitation to you as a student is that you really engage, from your curiosity.
AI has encouraged me to really focus on the process-oriented nature of ungrading, um, because I care more about how students are processing, or how they're engaging in the learning process. So how they mess up, how they revise, how they resubmit, how they give each other feedback, and then rethink things. Or how the iteration of their project. So that way they're engaging in self-reflection in different times, and thinking about and basically navigating ambiguity with some of their projects because they may be more community oriented. And also I think the way that AI comes into the classroom, if I see it, ungrading allows me to reserve the right to ask students to resubmit without penalty. I tell them from the beginning of the class that if you get an incomplete on an assignment, that's actually not a bad thing. It's actually, it's expected. And so if I ask a student to resubmit an assignment because I think that their voice could come through a little bit more, or I would I know I actually want to see some of the messiness of your ideas. I don't actually want it to be perfect. Um, and not only is that not a penalty, it's actually something I want to reward. I want to see your voice. I want to see something that wouldn't be seen as perfect or correct.
It changed the way I could respond to students' work, to their writing. So rather than spending time kind of pinning my comments to an A through F rubric, I was able to give them like complete or incomplete and then be very, very direct in my feedback. So let's take the case of a complete, but maybe it was something that we might traditionally score as a C, which in my mind is a fine grade, but in students' mind is not a fine grade, right? So they would get a complete in an ungrading system like mine. So they're satisfied with the complete. Their defenses are lowered. They're not feeling anxious about it. But I could say, this really meets the minimum. And what I would like to see you do next time moving forward, I could just be very plain. The space is already created for students to listen with the ungrading system. And with the incomplete, usually in an ungrading system, students can resubmit something. There's a mechanism for that. So the same thing, it's not really a failure. It's a, hey, let's try this again kind of thing. And I can be very plain, like this is what you need to do to move forward. So let's do it. I do believe that most students do things they shouldn't do or do things that maybe they don't want to do because they feel stressed, because they're pushed for time. So ungrading can lower that fear that often stokes, say, plagiarism or whatever. Students, at least in my experience, become more invested in their work. And so again, if they're more invested in their work, whether it's because you've co-created the syllabus or because, again, there's just less fear, they're less likely to cheat or to use tools that maybe we wouldn't want them to use, like generative AI in the case of my class. However, academic integrity, I do think we need to confront as a campus in a more systematic way um, the problem posed to learning by generative AI tools. I think the university sends a mixed message. Students, understandably so, are trying to economize their time, very busy. A lot of them are working jobs, they've got a lot of classes, they're very stressed. And they are turning to generative AI tools to do the thinking for them. And that is not serving them well, and it's not serving the institution well. And so I think that the question of academic integrity is a much bigger one that the university needs to confront.
What do you notice about instructional labor when you use ungrading, either for yourself or for teaching teams if you work with TAs? And what do you suggest instructors and TAs consider with regard to ungrading and their instructional labor?
It's always a good practice to work as a team and really sometimes if you're going to be evaluating or offering feedback on student work, that you at first take the time to do it together. That's something as a TA I got to experience. Barbara Rogoff was really great at when we were doing narrative evaluations. We would take, every time we had those assignments, we would take a few and work on them together to kind of sync up. Also, I think it's really important that we should advocate even more so for the low student to instructor team ratio. I think advocating for human evaluation is also really valuable. Ensuring that it's a human teaching team that's doing the evaluation really enriches students' learning. And I don't want to lose that. And I think that helps students feel connected to each other, helps the students feel connected to us, and that it's less of a transactional relationship, but also the teaching team gets to learn from each other and really, really grow as a teaching team.
It's something that I've noticed working with TAs and the framework of ungrading is that it allows also really rich conversations to happen between the TAs and the students. It's richer conversation. It's more consistent question asking from the students. Because I know students can be very intimidated, let alone asking me a question, sometimes asking the TA. But but one of the things I notice is this it's also enriching and empowering for the TA because I one of the things and I've learned this from Dr. Soraya Murray, who is a longtime mentor to me. It's this intellectual generosity that I always remind the students, like you're getting this not just from me and through the labor I'm engaging in being conversation and putting together lectures or presentations or activities for us to do. This labor is also really enriched by the TAs engagement in their scholarship, in their work, and they too have the expertise to show you how you engage in research methodologies. It's empowering to the TA because when we have conversations around ungrading, for example, if I say, the TA asks me, well, what do you consider complete versus incomplete? And I go, well, why don't you tell me your perception of that? What do you think would be considered complete? Or what would you accept? What would you find acceptable that this assignment be complete to you? I also kind of ask like, these are the things that I think, but what do you think? How might you do this differently? Or do you have suggestions? The reason why that's related to ungrading is because it kind of sets a tone for the course and how we work together as colleagues.
Feedback is the most time intensive and perhaps the most important. A lot of learning happens for students in feedback. And what I love about ungrading is that it makes the best use of that feedback time. So I'm not, again, pinning my comments to, for lack of a better word, justifying my comments based on the grade the text receives. I am giving students feedback that I hope will directly impact them as writers who are learning to write, not just in my class, but over their entire lifetime. We learn to write over our entire lives. And so my comments can be about specific assignments, yes, but also more, okay, I see you as a writer. I want you to think about this moving forward. I can just spend my time doing that rather than justifying a grade. So I think it may not lighten the grading load in that regard, or I should say the responding load, but it can make it more meaningful. And I think that's a huge, wonderful benefit. This can be a big time, not a time saver, but it's a shifting of the labor in a way that makes it better for everybody involved.
How would you describe the impact of ungrading in your courses?
I do ask students at the end of the term to report out to me on their overall experience in the course. What are the things that they would like me to keep or get rid of? A lot of the time they say, keep the grading, keep it, keep it, keep it, keep it. Nobody ever said that when I was using traditional grading, but consistently, a good portion of the students will say, keep the grading system. It really did help lower my anxiety. It lowered my fear of writing. So this is one of the big reasons why I've kept it. For now, yes, I'm going to continue with ungrading. In the future, I don't know, because the decision isn't solely in my hands. The decision is partly my interests and desires as an instructor, partly the institutional need, and a good portion of it is what helps students thrive as learners and writers. And ultimately, I have to choose something that works for them.
Ungrading has actually allowed for students to be a little bit more intentional about the way they also show up in their work. Is That's what I feel it's, if above all else, for me, that's what I've noticed that it has allowed for the students is a spaciousness to make the things they want to make, write the things that they feel most confused about or passionate about. When I've engaged in ungrading to the extent that the course then becomes a container for experimentation, that feels like more of a win and a success to me than telling the institution all of my students got 95 or above percent on something. I don't know, that to me, that's not how you build and sustain working with like potentially future community leaders, future scientists, artists, designers. And, I think sometimes as an educator, I think we forget that impact takes a long time to see. And even data and, metrics on, what students are learning, what they're gaining, that's a snapshot. That actually doesn't speak much more longitudinally to what a student actually gains from their experience, going to a 4-year college or university. And I think ungrading is a big part of that, about how do we change from just metrics and productivity to becoming this really amazing human being that is affecting change in the world, even within, their local neighborhood or the state or globally. I'm also an artist too, so I have a very different view of grades and classification and relationships to being categorized a particular in a particular way. And maybe selfishly I'm speaking this way because I really do see myself as I was one of those students that could have benefited from ungrading. But I think the reason why I want to continue using ungrading is because it's just a different way of being with students, having a dialogue with them in a way that I feel um, really actually starts to open up for them what's possible beyond the degree program itself. We also increasingly live in a world where, students, and rightly so, are anxious and nervous. Um, but if you build characteristics that actually force them to be critical and to be thoughtful and to be intentional, um, that's all I can ask. That's all I want actually from the student when they leave, and they're done with their time at UCSC.
At first, students may feel very anxious and maybe suspicious. And maybe about halfway through the course, they may still be asking, maybe concerned that we're going to pull the rug out from under them. For me, it's been important to learn to have patience through that and to be supporting students through that first initial stage of anxiety and uncertainty, understandably so. And then, but it's actually been really impactful. I've seen students talk about learning, and having that metacognition about their own student status or their own studentness, and how they want to take their scholarship outside of the classroom. It actually allows them to do the type of deep learning and creating that they couldn't do elsewhere. And I think part of that is because there isn't a risk aversion that they're experiencing, that they know that they can lean into something that feels risky or something new that isn't going to have material consequences on, because their GPA is going to suffer and they may not have access to financial aid or housing or things like that. And also, I get to see students develop relationships with each other and relationships with me in a way that pushes me as well. I feel less hierarchical. I feel like less that I'm the main expert and they come to me with questions, particularly because their projects may be about creating something and I'm guiding them on the process. And oftentimes, maybe in the beginning of the class, their first questions are like, well, how do I do this right or correct? And towards the end, they're like, how do I make impact? Or how do I make this sustainable? And those shift in their questions, I think is really telling about ungrading and their learning.